So it's my pleasure to introduce Greg Purdy to you folks today. Greg's been around so long in the industry that he really doesn't need an introduction, but we're going to give him one anyways. I was just chatting with Greg about how he started on in the insurance business, and his dad had a brokerage, and him and his brother were instrumental in building software when the first PCs first came out, and that would be back in the early 80s. So Greg has had a long involvement. Looking at his professional credentials, from 1988 rather to 2007, he was CEO of Applied Canada and the UK. Then from 2000 to 2018, he was managing partner with Pathway Partners, and he's the founding partner of Get Clarity. That's from 2011 to 2018. Get Clarity is doing some really interesting things from a data perspective, so this is the right person to be hosting this session. And he also he's the manager of the Canadian Insurance Strategy Group on LinkedIn, and he's been doing that since 2010. So if you're not a member of the Canadian Strategy Group, you need to be a member. So Greg, it's all yours.
Thank you. We have a very interesting session for you this afternoon. Wendy asked me to do this, I don't know, a month or so ago, and my response was, sure, I'd love to do it. I thought collectively we all know tons of people in the insurance industry, lots of company people that run data partner divisions and all that sort of stuff. So I started making phone calls to invite them to participate on this panel. And I had a number of companies say yes immediately. These fine gentlemen that I'll introduce shortly all agreed. But then I noticed some of them start disappearing off of their the list. They didn't want to share their positions on data and analytics and how they were interacting with their broker channel, which I think is very telling by itself. The fact that initially there were 3 or 4 other companies that were going to be here and participating that after second thought decided that they would prefer not to. So I think the questions that we're going to talk about today are important questions, and maybe if you're a broker, you may want to consider incorporating them into your discussions with your carrier partners, because they may have an impact on your business. So that's enough about that stuff. Larry Nickel is going to speak first. Larry's got 27 years experience in the insurance industry. He's been with Heartland for 8 years. He doesn't have a PowerPoint presentation, but he's going to talk us through a number of things. And then Steve Cutler from Frank Cowan is going to talk for a bit. Frank's developed a data warehouse and information strategy and is now director of IT at Frank Cowan, playing an interesting role in an interesting part of the market. So an MGA is going to play significant roles in the development and deployment of insurance products over the next few years. So I think it's really great that Steve is here. And then last, and certainly not least, is Paul Fletcher from Aviva. Paul is now Senior Vice President of Distribution. Aviva has gone through a number of changes in the last little while, and Paul has acquired a number of new responsibilities as a result of that. So we very much appreciate him taking the time today to come and talk to us about their strategy. So I will now let Larry talk us through some of the points that he'd like to make. I will ask questions at the end of the presentations and then throw it open to the floor so that you can ask some questions as well.
Okay, so hopefully you can all hear me. Yeah, I have no slides, so I'm going to keep this really short, try to not depend too much on my charm here. So Heartland is a small carrier, for those of you that don't know us. We're kind of a niche player, and we do not have in-house actuary. We did start an analytics team about, I want to say 5 or 6 years ago now, I guess. And generally speaking, they've been focused on pricing. So trying to develop pricing for our products, the actuarial filings that were required for automobile in Ontario, that kind of thing. But it is interesting, the comments made about some carriers deciding at the last minute not to come today and not wanting to share some of that information. I can tell you, from those of you that know me, you've heard this story. I live with a broker, and I hear about it every night at home, that the black box is so frustrating because as a personal line CSR, she has no idea where the premiums come from. And when she asks an underwriter, they're told they're not supposed to ask about that. And so how do you explain that to a policyholder when the rates suddenly go up or down? So one of the things that Heartland has tried to do is we've had a guiding principle around that we won't have the black box in that sense, that if you get out a paper, pen, and calculator, any of our underwriters can explain where the rates come from. It might take a little while, and there might be a lot of math involved, but we can make that available. So it's something that's been very important to us, that we kind of see it as a little bit different, I think, than some of the others in the industry. Now that said, with the way sort of, I guess, the customer experience is going and trying to streamline things, we also recognize that we need to change as well, and it's interesting how the brokers fit into that. In terms of looking at data a bit differently, rather than us, and depending on brokers to do it on our behalf, collecting data through complicated or lengthy applications and questionnaires, we need to start looking at buying data and integrating data. I use the example, it's come up numerous times, we mentioned it at lunch today. We had an oil tank questionnaire that was 28 questions long, and when we really started looking at, well, what do we do with that data? Well, we scan it, we put it into a static PDF, and it gets filed, and there's maybe 2 data points off of that we actually use. So we've got to start thinking about changing the way we do these things, and that's something that we've just sort of started at Heartland. The other thing a few things I'd quickly mention. We are starting to look at we built our brand a few years ago when we went through a merger, and we've realized that the brand identity is very important to really sort of say who we are, and there's a lot of data and analytics that are going to go on behind that. And just to give you one example, we're building sort of psychographic profiles, which Greg tells me this is what his company specializes in, so apparently we're supposed to chat afterwards. I don't know. So it's one of those things where we're trying to, rather than just say, well, we like this value of home, or we like people with new cars, or that kind of thing. It's more John and Mary Smith, age 42 years old, live in a small town, and they pay their bills on time, and that kind of thing, trying to develop those profiles. So we're doing some work around that. And one of the things that we want to tap into, that we've had some discussion that has come up with some of us internally, is the social media analytics. So while today I think we're going to focus on brokers and carriers and the analytics and the data that we have, there is a raft of social media stuff out there that we're just not tapping into. I always tell the story, I met a gentleman from Facebook a couple years ago, and when he understood what our business model was, he said, Larry, if you want to know how many 45-year-old men in Ontario that are married with children, that like fly fishing and live in rural Ontario and want to buy a new Ford F-150 this year, I can give you that data. So there's things out there that I think we haven't even tapped into yet. We tend to look at ourselves and we tend to look at the brokers, but I think we need to think beyond that. And then the final thing I just mentioned is the oil tank questionnaire that I mentioned, the dead data. There's a lot of data that we have that we're simply not using and that we'd like to use, but we have, which I would guess a lot of carriers have, an older system that isn't the most robust system. It doesn't talk to the broker systems. It doesn't have validation in it. So, I always use the example, you could enter the year built of a home as AA instead of 1985. I've actually seen that show up in reports, so I know people have done it. So there is a lot of garbage in there that really kind of skews the data when we do the analysis, so we need to be careful of that. The last point I would mention is just the, frankly, a little bit of exhaustion in having these discussions, is trying to get people at the carrier side and people in the broker force to just buy into what we're even talking about today. I feel like we're constantly selling this idea of data, analytics, digital, consumer behavior. A lot of people are in a lot of denial, and especially in our space, which is very rural-oriented, people think of it as being very traditional and old-fashioned, but then I point out to them that, everybody wants their self-driving car. Well, on the farm, they've had GPS auto steer on tractors for over a decade. They've had self-driving cars. So, the rural folk, I think, sometimes there's a lot of misunderstanding about that, and we do it ourselves. So we're trying to understand how that affects our business as well.
I'm going to turn this over to
Thank you. So, Steve Cutler, Director of IT and Data Governance. The data governance piece was Paul, I keep collecting hats. That came up about 5 years ago, and then about 4 years ago, the Director of IT came about. My background's a little varied. I started in the industry as a personal lines underwriter and worked my way up into a claims manager role at some point, and have been a project director, and now have these roles within the IT world. So a little bit of a varied journey, but that's helped me when I've started at Frank Cowan to understand the whole business. I wanted to give you an idea of what our journey through and some of our challenges were through setting up a data warehouse, which is where I was brought into Frank Cowan to do, and maybe highlight the bits of data that we have that may point out some opportunities that could happen in the future for perhaps sharing information. So it all started with retirement. The person who put everything together said, at Frank Cowan said, you know, I'm going to retire in a few years and you might want to get reports out, so let's do something different. And they decided to build a data warehouse. I was brought in to do it. So I managed the project and architected the warehouse. We came up with a purpose and some principles to help us, because we knew it would be a long journey, and we knew that there would be a ton of information that we didn't know as we're going back through thousands of data files to try to figure out what information do we have that we could use moving forward. So we created some principles to kind of help us guide us through this step. We took steps. A lot of things that I've heard in various presentations today sounded really familiar. We decided to do this in chunks. How do you eat that elephant? One bite at a time. We tried to chunk it down, and we tried to build a project plan that would allow us over phases to understand what we were doing. We were building this all in-house, so we had to learn as well some of the source data that we had, as well as some of the techniques that we were going to use. And we were going to base this was an enterprise data warehouse. So it wasn't just limited to marketing or to underwriting. It was underwriting, marketing, claims. It was everything right across the board, statistical, financial as well. So we started, we picked something for reinsurance, which was really a year's worth of data, a little complex, but a year's worth of data that we thought we could get our heads around, and it worked. We managed to, there was a large set of schedules that we had to produce that used to take anywhere between 8 and 12 weeks to actually produce all of the schedules, and we have it down now to about 3 days. It takes 3 days because there's always 1 or 2 policies in there that have something miscoded on them, and it takes that long to find it. But we can get it down to about 3 days. Then we took a look at our premium data, so we have a very broad depth of premium data, and we were looking at 18 years worth of history. So now we've gone from 1 year to 18, and we started to get into cleansing problems. We started getting into data that wasn't as clean as we wanted, although the premium data was cleansed to some degree. And then we worked on claims, which was the oldest data sets that we had. It was a whole new set of problems, but really the same problems. It was uncleansed at all, but it was sourcing, it was data definitions, and cleansing the data. We were able to use this to feed it back into our processes to increase our efficiency. The report's down from 12 weeks to 3 days. And we have better conversations with our partners now, because we understand the profitability of our book of business and what's driving it, so that we can have much better conversations with our partners. Somebody mentioned that before, but knowledge is power. So if you can have that knowledge, you have a lot of leverage about this is where our book is going. Some of the challenges that we found is data definition. We take it for granted that we know what written premium means. The story was related to me by one of our vice presidents who had the president call him and say, excuse me, you reported that the premium was X, where I have a report from another department that the premium's Y, that's about $300,000 less. Why is it different? And the reason why is because we were measuring different things. The one on the old report was about how much our underwriting department is processing, whereas the one in the new report, as we redefined how we were target marketing our business, was about what we were selling. So it was a new way of looking at things, but we hadn't come to the universal understanding right across the company that there are different ways of looking at the premium, and you have to understand what's my question before you understand what the answer is. Vocabulary was another thing we had to tackle. we used the same names to mean different things and different names to mean the same things, and then just for kicks, we would have a conversation and use them interchangeably. It was very difficult to sometimes have a conversation, so we had to actually define what it was we were talking about. In the case of written premium, this is the written premium that was processed. This is the written premium that, from our marketing department, was earned. Data quality, I think we talked in a number of different cases about data quality. Some we could fix. We went back in the 18 years worth of history, we could fix some. Some we could source from other places, mostly internally, but actually some externally as well. And some we just had to live with. Some of the old data, we just didn't know what the claim city was, where the claim took place, and we had to migrate it. We put migrated. We had to get creative with it in some way that we would understand, as we were looking at it, what this data might mean. Time. It took a lot when you tell somebody that they've been getting a report for 10 years, that doesn't really mean what you think it means. It takes a long time to prove that, and we had to go back over our algorithms, the things that we were doing in order to get them to believe it, and properly so, to validate what we were doing, to make sure that we did it right. The last part I had on there was communication. Not so much as a challenge, other than you are constantly having to communicate. What is it you're doing, why you're doing it, what you're trying to accomplish, and what some of the challenges that you're facing, the pitfalls that you're chasing. It's not really a conclusion, sorry. But in conclusion, I do happen to like science fiction, fantasy literature. These words are allegorically correct, and I was happy to see in one of the other presentations this morning somebody mentioned it's not magic. It isn't magic. It's having a vision about what you're trying to do, what your goals are. It is a lot of hard work to get there, and it's trying to be consistent about your approach to getting there. The magic kind of comes back in when you start to build your analytics process. You start to answer different questions that haven't been asked before, because it was taking too long to get the answer, because we couldn't get the data, because we weren't certain about the data. But then it becomes easier to get it. And when somebody says, oh, I wish I could do this, well, I can get that data for you, Larry. And actually I can. I can turn it around fairly quickly now. Warning. Once you start going down this path and start doing it, everybody wants more data. It is a self-perpetuating thing, which is a good thing, because then you can get at a finer level of information and a better way of managing our business. I'm sure we all know this, but we've all tripped over it from time to time. Executive buy-in is key. I had a leadership group who was fully vested in making sure that I could be successful at this. And it was one of the reasons why we were successful at being able to build this practice. It is absolutely key. Looking forward, just because we speak the same language doesn't mean we're saying the same thing. We have different, even if we know what coverage is, I bet you we have different definitions of it. We have different valid value lists. So it's not just as easy as communicating back and forth with our lists of coverages with what a client is. I know that sounds strange, but it's true. There's still a lot of work before we can take that data point, make it information that we both can understand, and turn it into knowledge for both of our businesses. Imagine, and this is kind of looking in the future, one of the things that we've been trying to do is be able to give profiles of what our clients look like, so that we've worked on our profitability and understanding what's driving that profitability. If we could partner, and we're not at this place yet, but if we could give you the information that for your book of business with Frank Cowan Company was 20% less profitable than the other counts in that bit of characteristics, in those characteristics, could you make some decisions on it? What happens if it was 20% better than that book of business? You might want to market more to it. Can we help do that? Those are some of the things that perhaps moving forward that we could work on.
Just before you pass the baton there, after you finished your data warehouse, did your perspective on who your clients actually were change?
I would say no in our case, because of where we were focused. We were focused on bringing the data in to know what our performance was like, as opposed to an external marketing perspective at that point in time. I think it's changing.
Right.
It's certainly a conversation that's being had now.
Okay, great. Paul.
I'm going to stand up if that's okay. Good, excellent. Introduce myself, Paul Fletcher. Thanks, Jeff, for earlier on. So I've been around in the Canadian business for about 17 years. I'm, insurance-wise, I see a few faces in the room that I recognise, but worked for Aviva in one of its forms or other for just over 30 years now. Worked in every single department or function in the organisation other than actuarial. I'm not smart enough, basically, is the deal for that, and the quants or the geeks of that particular world, but very, very key community for all of us, that particular group is. So I tend to tell stories. My role in Aviva at the moment, as Jeff indicated, has sort of evolves, and it always evolves. I was responsible not too long ago for strategy, business transformation, and as part of that, I had an R&D team, which were all about this kind of stuff, data and how it could be used into the future. Probably about 2 years ago, I was involved in integrating the RBC business into the Aviva organisation. So shortly after that acquisition, that was probably about 10, 11 months of my life, and for the last year or so, been working in the distribution space. Role is typically, I use 3 phrases: grit, grease, or glue. Depending on the situation, I might be some grease, I might be some glue, and I might be some grit, and that's just situational depending on what's needed at the time. So what we're going to talk about, I tend to tell stories as we go through things, and so on the board there, it's hidden away. I apologize for that. So in the light, so I'm going to cover a little bit about the potential of this stuff is proven. I'm then going to talk about some conditions for success that need to be in place for the data space. I'm actually struggling to give you some insights into the Aviva Roadmap, and then finally a pause for thought in this space, because it's always worth doing that. So there's 4 areas I'm going to cover, but the first area is really when we talk about the potential that is proven. And I'm building on Jeff's metaphor here, which is there is gold mine in, he says carrier data. I actually think it's all our data. Yeah, so many brokers say, give us the data, talk about the insights and all that kind of stuff, and that's really important. As an insurer, we look at our stuff and go, it's incomplete. And the other half that makes it complete and makes it powerful is actually typically in your BMS, interestingly enough. And it's when it comes together. And then maybe we can bring in some other third-party sources, maybe organisations like Jeff's are able to pull that together. Greg's able to pull that together, sorry. And, we can really make the insight. But the concept is proven, and I'll give you some examples. The R&D team I used to work with were able to identify with very, very high confidence from our client book, and I say our client book, profitable customers who were likely to leave us. Yeah, so our most profitable customers, and I mean profit from the point of view of performance, underwriting performance, as well as profitability to you. And we're able to do that with very high confidence. The problem that we faced was actually giving that information to you in a consumable, usable way, which is one of the sort of conditions for success moving forwards. I'll give you another example. We were able to go through people like us or people like you exercises. So we'd identify a profile of a customer. We talked about some profiles earlier on. And we would be able to say, right, we are pretty confident that somebody like this probably owns a small boat, small craft. And we were actually able to surprise ourselves more often than you'd think, because we would identify through other databases and our own sort of client book individuals where we thought, we don't insure their boat, but we think they're probably, the odds are quite high of them being interested in boating and things like RVing and those kind of sectors. And one of our sort of golden moments was, targeting in an area not too far from here actually in Mississauga, and doing a Google Street View, and freaking hell, there is a boat on the driveway of, so we were able to prove that more often than not, this kind of insight works. But the challenge is actually how do you deploy it in a way that can be used by us? So one of the, so I'll talk about some of the conditions here. So there's gold bars in terms of data, there's nuggets, and there are sort of fine gold dust. And I'd suggest, one of the challenges, and I think somebody said earlier on, I think it was the marketing guy up here earlier on, was saying you've got to combine business people with your data people. If you don't do that, the data people tend to chase off into what's interesting. Yeah? And they might walk past gold bars and gold nuggets while they do that, because they don't actually realize necessarily that they're valuable and important to you. Yeah? So we've seen examples of that kind of piece. And that's what I sort of say, beware of fool's gold as well, because you can spend a lot of money on this stuff, really a lot of money, a lot of time, and a lot of effort. And if it's just dust that you're picking up, is it really worth that kind of effort? So I'll give an example at the end where I say sometimes we walk past gold bars and don't even realize we've done it. And I'll give you an example of that at the very end. Okay, so conditions for success. We've seen a lot of things and we've learned a lot of lessons. And I'm going to call, you may have seen this, I think it's Gartner created the original of this, which is really the cycle of hype. Yeah? So technology firms are the best at doing this, yeah? They need investment because this stuff's not cheap. So they create massive potential in the market, yeah? And then everyone piles in and it's exciting, and then suddenly the delivery is much harder than we all expected. We've all seen this, yeah? And then after a while it stabilizes, yeah? Well, somebody introduced me to the concept recently of there are 3 cycles of hype before a product really starts to pay off, yeah? So I'm thinking UBI. Usage-based insurance. I was involved in the very first cycle of hype. Happy to admit that. Worked with Progressive, worked with a company in the UK, and brought a pilot to Canada, and it was his first cycle of hype. The second cycle of hype started around 2013. The first one, by the way, was 2006. Second cycle of hype, 2013. We're about to enter the third cycle of hype, I would suggest, where it will actually, potentially for the companies that are involved, really drive value for them. We were talking about Bitcoin and blockchain earlier on. I heard that conversation going on. If ever there was something in the first cycle of hype, it's that particular world. Now, blockchain is going to change the world, change many institutions, absolutely. I'd suggest it's not going to do it in the next 2 years. And a lot of people have looked at the insurance cycle, and it's tough to find high payoff use cases that we can all really get behind. Yeah? But it is coming, but there'll be 2 or 3 cycles of hype. So one of the lessons is, go through a couple of cycles of hype and watch carefully and learn what you can. Don't necessarily jump in too quickly. I talked about the lesson about mixing the team. Don't make it all analysts. You need business insight coming through. Steve here was talking about the need to organize your data. He talked about data warehouse. We have a thing called a data lake. We are in a world where we can create jargon, aren't we? Yeah? But the data has got to be cleaned. It's got to be captured in a way that is easily accessed. There's a lot of other sources of data. It's got to be able to fit together and be interpreted. And there's a lot of complexity around all of that world. So organizing your data in a consumable way is really critical in here. We then need to be flexible with it because the world is changing and new tools, new techniques come along all the time as well. So it's got to be structured so that we can adapt it to the new waves. I'm going to talk about connectivity. We found that one of our problems was on the propensity of customers who were likely to leave us, who are profitable. We tested that by giving people like you lists. Yeah, please phone up, please try and keep these people. And we created control lists, by the way, A/B lists, so that we could sort of measure things over 6 to 9 months. Yeah. Now, running a business by giving our brokers lists isn't exactly going to be efficient, optimal, helpful. It can prove a concept, but the system has got to work in a connected way. So we've got to be able to sort of make sure that those cases are highlighted for you electronically so that your handlers and your CSRs can use it in a painless and easy way. That's way easier to say than it is to do. And it's way easier to say in a world where the connectivity with BMSs between insurers and brokers and the Avivas of this world, I think you probably talked about that this morning, is kind of shaky from time to time. Yeah, so connectivity through APIs or whatever is a real critical piece as well moving forwards. So getting insights into the right place at the front of the queue is one of our lessons. So all of that's in the hype space. So what is our roadmap? Again, I'm keeping with the gold mining theme, if I may. Yeah. So I'll talk about the Aviva Roadmap. We currently are investing significant time. We have a decent-sized team working on the data lake, organising the data. We have lots of internal use cases that we believe in, absolutely. Some of them are being connected and called upon in our existing operations automatically through internal APIs. One of the challenges we have is how do we get it into your hands? So we are working with each of the BMSs in one way or another, on one level or another, to start building those connections. And obviously the pull that comes from the broker community is going to be helpful to that because you are essentially their primary customers. So we're looking for broker support in that particular space. But I'm going to put some thoughts out there as I begin to wrap here, so the pause for thought stuff. Okay? When the gold rush was going on, how many people who were actually miners became millionaires and billionaires? Yeah? You can invest a lot of time in this kind of space. Yeah? There's always people willing to sell you a great concept or a way of doing something. And one of the things that Aviva is very keen to do, and we do it with our digital marketing team, consulting team, DMC, is help brokers guide through that set of choices, give a bit of a roadmap, and try and reduce the risk by vetting suppliers, vetting ideas, and working with people. So that's one area in our roadmap that we do today, and delivers high value. But the people who really make the money out of the gold mining, Levi Strauss, jeans, made a bloody fortune. And established his business, or that business, by selling to the mugs who were going up the, to the Klondike and the California Gold Rush, yeah? So that's sort of a pause for thought there. And here's a final one around data and about walking past things. Is there a correlation between the profitability of airlines and the profitability of insurers? So I'll leave you to ponder on that one for a moment. So there's not a perfect correlation, but there is a correlation because both of those organisations have their profitability correlated to the price of oil. Yeah? 35% of an airline's costs is oil, is fuel. Yeah? So inside there, insurers on the auto side, and this is about walking past now really significant gold bars of data, insurers, our profitability is also correlated to how many kilometres are driven every single year on the roads by the fleet on the road. And that correlates to the price of oil. Yeah? Now, believe it or not, we have that information really easily available on a go-forward basis, which is oil futures. The data is right in front of us. But as an insurance industry, we're looking behind us and we're looking around us. But there's actually really, really insightful big rocks of information that are available, which is why you need business people looking at data as well as just analysts. So that's my piece to provoke some thoughts, and it's back to the discussion.
Great, thank you. Couple of points. First, I think we actually did the insights for you on the boat. So that was a few years ago. It was a fun project. You mentioned, that you have developed, some fairly sophisticated abilities in manipulating data, understanding data, and deriving insights. And one of your challenges is deploying that to brokers. And the broker BMS may not be in a place to be able to catch that data. Do you feel right now that the environment with the BMSs is changing and they are more willing to have that conversation about?
So absolutely, everybody's aware of the potential there, but each organisation has, whether it's an insurer or a broker or a BMS provider, have different histories and different legacy environments. So everyone is starting from a slightly different place. So I think everyone would agree with endpoints. the concept of APIs, which I'm sure everyone's kind of heard of to death, and sharing data cleanly and efficiently is kind of a buzzword in the industry right now, but that is the key to helping information flow in a way that both sides can understand and can use, and then apply the algorithms and business logic to, so that value can be generated, because there is a series of steps there. So I would say yes, everybody's aware, but the time and effort to get there is going to differ by organisation.
So that's sort of the, for lack of a better description, the pipeline between the company and the brokers, CSRs, and producers, the BMSs, and all of that technology in the middle. Are the brokers on the other side able to incorporate that information? So if the pipeline works fine, is the broker ready to catch, receive, and action that information?
So I think it's how this is a perspective here, and Heartland and Aviva might have a slightly different perspective on then how that gets deployed. So we would love it if everybody is able to use the information at the front line smartly.
Right.
Absolutely, that's a perfect scenario for everybody, but it doesn't always need to be visible to that individual that it is happening. So you'll see things through the various quote systems. You may see red, greens, or ambers. You may see scores appearing. Those require someone to act based on the stimulus.
Right.
Yeah. There's other ways that it just happens through the business flow, and I'll be frank, the most likely to happen, 100% effectively, without leakage and deviation, is the one that happens without people really realising it's going on, and it's just part of the natural business flow.
Right. The other, Larry?
Yeah, and I kind of looked at this question a little bit differently. I think, and kind of walking past the gold bars thing, a lot of the focus is on very specific data, which is from an application, as I said before. And so as a company, and at a prior life, a company I was at, we spent a ton of time analyzing retention strategies around pricing. So if we took a 1% rate increase, how many people would we lose? How many people would we keep? What if we took a 2%? And so there was a lot of that kind of discussion going on, a lot of that kind of analysis. But I heard something from one of the other sessions that kind of tweaked me about the form of communication, for example. So one thing as a carrier, we have no idea, okay, so if we put the rate up 2% and our retention drops from 89 to 88 or whatever happens, what is your piece of that? And how is that effective? Because we forget that, and I'm reminded of this every night at home, she's having those conversations with the policyholder. Well, what's an effective conversation look like? How do you retain that client with the carrier? What about, like I said in one of the other sessions, they were talking about the form of communication. People's preferred form of communication is one thing we're really trying to understand. So whether it's text, email, phone calls, face-to-face, how does that affect retention? So taking it well beyond just very specific points of data from the application, I think is somewhere where we need to kind of understand that there's a ton of gold in the broker, not just the BMS and those very specific data points, but the way you guys deal with the customer. And we need to do a lot more to understand that and what's effective and what isn't.
So you just touched on, I think, what is probably the motivation for all of this fun stuff with data and analytics. Nobody's doing this for the sake of having the smartest algorithm or the biggest data lake or any of those things. Ultimately, the objective is to improve the client service, improve the acquisition cost by reducing it, tailoring the service levels and the communication to the specific individual so that you're not spending more time on the phone talking about things that are not material to the transaction. Those are all big challenges, and maybe we get red lights and green lights in quotation systems and some of those things. But there's a lot more background information that's probably required to fully inform that producer, CSR, broker about how to manage that transaction. Are you, Larry, are you building analytics in that area? You've talked about analytics around pricing, retention. Those are sort of internal performance metrics. Are you attempting to build analytic solutions that are sort of more forward-facing?
So that is one of the challenges we have. So we have a very, again, being a small company with a small analytics group, one of the challenges we have is they're very focused on two things right now. One is the basic pricing strategies, and the other is, and it was mentioned by both the other panelists, is the amount of reports and pulling out the data and being able to manage that data. They're very focused because of the limitations of our system on one-off reporting. So we constantly ask them, well, what about this? Well, what about this? And what about that? And you know, it's been mentioned a few times today about the business people and the analytics side, and the concern is always that the math guys get carried away and go down rabbit holes, but the business guys can do the exact same thing. And so there has to be a lot of yin and yang go on there. So to answer your question directly, no, we haven't got that far, but we're having those discussions.
And is the cost factor playing a role in how fast you consider these kinds of solutions?
I would say it's more a prioritization exercise. There's a lot of, when I mentioned before about sort of the personal exhaustion of having these conversations and trying to get by, and part of it is that there's a real impetus to just focus on what you're doing today. Just do it well, and it'll be fine. There's not a lot of forward thinking going on, and that's
Right.
one of the challenges.
So it's interesting to get that perspective. We have a big company, we have a smallish company, and we have an MGA, each with a slightly different perspective. Steve, what would, your ability to manage the relationship with the end consumer kind of goes through another channel in your world. How would you see your ability to deploy information to your partners to enhance that transaction?
Uncomfortable question with an honest answer today, not very well. Being more of a commercial writer, in prioritization, we've worked on more internal focus. It's interesting that we're having more of those conversations, though, to say, what would that look like? What might that look like? And actually having conversations with our marketing team about what does it look like even for them? How can we provide information that's better for them to make better calls, make better decisions?
Right.
Which I think is for us the first step of, okay, well, what else could we do to take that outside of the organization?
Right. I appreciate the honest answer. I think it's important for, brokers to actually hear the various issues that companies have to deal with. So even with Paul, more resources available to you, you probably still have issues.
Completely the same issues. Organising the data, filtering it through, prioritising the resource. There is a real insight in focusing on the problem that you're trying to solve rather than exploring what the data might tell you as well. So you are actually bird dogging, you're focused on a problem, a genuine business problem that is worth solving. That risks that you lose the sort of innovation element and surprise element that can be fun and can be, there could be real gold there, but at least you're more likely to be paying the bills by being very focused on solving actual business problems. But even with, what is not that much of a larger team, but it is probably a larger team, there's always the cost and prioritisation of resource element, which is really the same thing actually.
Yeah, absolutely.
Coming into play.
So I think we would probably all agree that analytics and data by themselves is not the target that we're trying to solve for. We're trying to solve for insights into the consumer's wishes, desires, needs, and where they are in their life journey. Where do you think brokers are? So we've had a couple sessions today that were more broker focused, but from a company perspective, honestly, where do you think the majority of brokers are in terms of their ability to action this kind of information today, 2018?
So I personally am working with at least two larger organisations who are really putting some thought around the data assets that they have and how they can use them. They are not national or international brokers,
No.
so that just goes without saying that the largest think that way. But certainly both of these organisations are investing time, and they're bumping into exactly the same kind of problems, by the way, particularly as very often they've acquired other brokerages with different platforms and different systems and different, so their legacy complication is just the same as ours.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a different type of complication, but when you get to the root of it, it's the same.
Right.
But people are thinking this way, but I think I started my piece with, we look across the sort of wall and say, oh, we like what access, the client-focused access that many brokers hold, to a greater or lesser degree of quality, to be fair. And we go, that would be really helpful if we applied it to some of our data. That's probably where value comes, combined with third-party data as well. But the trick becomes then it either gets political or permission-based or sensitivities or who's doing what with it and who should be able to monetize it. That gets an interesting conversation as well. And I think we're not all through that one.
Right. It's you've just touched on a couple of sensitive points. I did have a question around them. I've been in this business for a very long time, as pointed out earlier. I have never felt that technology was ever the problem. The solutions that were available were always much farther ahead than the marketplace. The real issue tended to focus around, politics and trust. Politics between the various organizations that are involved in, defining how all this works, and trust between those partners, and trust between the broker community and the carrier community. And individually, I think there's, that exists between brokers and companies, but collectively, it's probably not where it really needs to be. And I suppose one of the solutions for that particular problem is transparency. And is there a role for data and analytics to play in, providing more transparency on the insurance transaction to the broker and to the consumer? Anybody want to touch that?
I suspect, next question, please. I suspect that there is, the challenge would be, again, the interpretation between, we have different companies up here, if we have different brokers out there, how do we make sure that we're talking about the same thing? How do we get to the point where it is actually transparent?
Right.
And I think that is one of the bigger challenges, perhaps. I know some of the, sort of like taking a little bit of a squirrel route here. In Amanda's, in the one session this morning, I thought Amanda did an amazing job with being able to take information back into her processes. And so that was kind of a micro thing from what that one broker was doing, taking a look at some of the data that they're getting, filtering it back into their sales process. I thought she was doing a fantastic job being able to do that. I think to answer your question about the transparency, though, is how do we take that and now make it broader between all of the individual broker segments and the individual company segments?
Right.
Speaking for myself, I think we sometimes have trouble just internally within Frank Cowan and the departments, making sure that we can have transparent transactions.
Sure. I think that's probably, Wendy would suggest, one of the roles of Orbit is to, facilitate some of that transparency in the dialogue between brokers and companies. But it's an interesting time. The industry is at a point where we're kind of reevaluating how data gets moved back and forth between brokers and companies. And I think this morning we heard somebody suggest that CSIO XML was probably not the long-term solution, but at least a starting point, which is true. I'll move off of the sensitive stuff and come back to the more politically correct. So are brokers, from your perspective, willing, so they may be willing partners in wanting the outcome. Are they willing partners in investing in this, or are they looking to you to support them financially in deploying these kinds of solutions?
I'll jump in on that one. I get the sense that even from a small carrier like us, we kind of made a poor judgment or a bad assumption last year when we first started having these discussions is we kind of approached it that we thought brokers would want to take the lead and sort of drive this issue, but we very quickly realized that even from a small player like us, they're still looking for us to take the lead and tell them what we want to do, what our plan is, what will work, and then try to understand how that integrates or doesn't with them. So rather than take a passive approach, certainly not an aggressive approach, but a more proactive approach is looked for. They're looking, I get the sense that brokers are looking for direction. I agree with you, there are some players that are very, very assertive about it and getting into things, but for the most part, especially the small to medium brokers, a lot of who we deal with, they're looking for help and they're looking for direction. So they're open to it. You haven't even got to discussions about financial yet in a lot of cases. It's just a conversation at this point more than anything.
Steve?
In our particular market space, not having a lot of those conversations at this point.
Paul?
I think the associations and the BMSs are stimulating good conversations in this particular space. I think what we're probably going to see over the next 2 years, I mean, I'm going to be quite frank, insurer results are going to be quite stressed over the next 2 years. Yeah, that will have two outcomes. Outcome number one is the ability to invest is constrained. There won't be as much money to be invested. And some other channels, it's easier to get results in, so they may get prioritized, and some of our competitors with sort of big books in that particular space may make faster progress in leveraging data insights. So that's a risk for an insurer like Aviva, and I'm not happy about that. The second outcome of a constraint like that, which is less money to be spent, is that you may see some stress within the value chain. Because when there's less money floating around, you tend to get constraint, but that has two things. It creates a bit of pain sometimes, but a bit of pain actually often leads to smart innovation.
Right.
Comes. So I think I can deliver pros and cons, and I'll give both of those statements. It's very easy to give the pros all the time. I think it's also worth saying sometimes there's a con. Yep.
I flipped back to the screen just for that last question. So if we assume that carriers are going to be stressed from a results perspective over the next couple of years, is there an opportunity for some carriers and some brokers to leapfrog their competition by, very smartly and precisely deploying some analytics and data solutions?
I would say absolutely there's an opportunity, but finding the recipe or the key that you...
So the opportunity may exist. So I think where you're probably going to go is where there's an opportunity, there's a risk. How do we measure the risk of engaging in that solution, which leads to another question: is how do you measure the return on these things? You spend lots of money, you have lots of people. Sometimes they come back with gold dust when you were expecting gold bricks. What's the proper way to measure success in these sorts of projects? I'll just let each of you take a shot at that.
Yeah, I think, you've got to kind of try to take an ROI point of view, but I think a lot of it is simply just whether you've got success in what you've done. So just to give one example, and again, I know none of the carriers like to stand up here and talk specifics. I'll give you one specific. So one of the things when we did a deep dive on our book of business on the auto side, most companies have gone to some sort of micro rating, individualized rating or whatever, but what we found was pretty big nugget actually. In certain pockets of rural Ontario, date when first licensed, which we're not the first one to discover this, seems to really matter in terms of profitability, but what we discovered because of our niche, the more we dug into it and back tested it, the more we realized that the difference in getting licensed at 16 versus getting licensed later in life for our sort of marketplace is dramatic. We're talking, I've never seen anything like it. I've sat in a lot of actuarial meetings and I've never seen numbers like this before. So it was something where there was a real opportunity for us there, and we took a chance, and so we did a rate filing.
Sorry, just to be clear, date first license.
Date when first licensed when you're driving. So
What
if you're 16 years old and get licensed at 16, go get your first test. The profitability of that as a risk versus somebody that gets licensed later in
higher?
life, the loss ratio is dramatically lower. It's like 30% versus 90% for us. You don't normally see those kind of variations on
No.
one data point like that.
Right.
And actually, the analytics that we did on it when we dove deeper, if we could done the rate filing based on the month you got licensed, loss ratio is almost zero when they get licensed at 16. So there's something going on in rural Ontario with getting licensed at 16. But anyway, but it allowed us to do something that, again, I keep saying small company, but we are a small company. We don't take a lot of risk. We're very cautious, incremental kind of approach. Well, we took an aggressive risk. And so to answer, a long-winded way of answering your question, we are seeing that business come in a significant way now. And we are seeing early indications are that it is as profitable as we expected it to be. So you can, but you've really got to make sure, and there is a certain risk involved for sure.
So in that case, the measurement was the ultimate profitability of the target audience as a result of that, that change.
Yes.
For us, some of the things that we've measured, efficiency, being able to turn around information in a quicker period of time. Being able to turn around more information in a quicker period of time, and this then gets into somewhat anecdotal, where our leadership team can actually make good decisions on, or make better, what they would think would be better decisions than what they were making before. Turning around, one of the sessions mentioned this morning about, well, do I have data for that? Do I have a fact for that? To be able to produce some information, whereas before it was kind of, yeah, I think that's good. Actually being able to turn around and say, well, here's some data that might back that up. Sometimes it's not an exact match, but in other cases, you can get fairly close.
Right.
So those are some of the things that we've used.
So it involves time again in terms of.
So from my perspective, there is two ways of looking at it. First, you need to build the capability. That is a business case. Business case means that we need to see a potential payoff with a range of certainty around delivery. It brings in the risk factor. One of the roles I've had in the past is I was kind of the bank manager for projects. So if someone wanted $1 million to do a project, I want to see a business case and I want to challenge it. I want to kick it around and do I believe it? What have I got to believe for that case? And then am I going to discount it? And I'll be brutally frank, if it's a cost-cutting one, I believe it. If it is an underwriting indemnity one, I almost believe it. And if it's a business growth because we're going to sell more, I don't believe it. And I discount it at least 50%. Okay? Just as a kind of rule of thumb. And if I lend you $1 million, you owe me $2 million, and you don't get a penny more until you pay me my $2 million. Kind of concept. It's not quite that brutal. But that's the going in conversation.
I think there's a television show that's waiting for you.
So that goes back to that. The second element, though, is things are then incremental. So once you have the capabilities, you want to see A/B testing. You want to see people trying things out and optimizing and learning over time.
Right.
So there's a second phase once you've built your core capability, because that's where the real payoff comes, because your first goes at it are never perfect.
Right.
And if you expect them to be perfect, you're deluding yourselves and your teams.
Right.
Yeah, so you give the teams the opportunity to fail a bit faster, to learn a few things, and then implement from there on.
Right.
But there's real payoff if you get systematic A/B testing, which was again talked about in the marketing session if you were in the room. A/B testing is critical in this space.
Okay. I'm going to throw it open for a couple of questions. Do we have how much time left? Yep, we have time left. Anybody would like to take a shot? A question?
Yeah.
Guys are really thirsty.
We are in between.
We are in between, yes. Okay.
Yeah, it's interesting. We had some discussions internally because, the data, okay, so we were looking at every point of data that we could look at, and we were kind of trying to throw a wide net, trying to see things. So we were probably doing what we shouldn't do, is we let the data drive a bit of the discussion, but we've discovered, actually, the other one I didn't mention, which was a lot more controversial, was the soccer mom surcharge, which is on accident benefits. You see women ages between, 25 and 45 or something, perform very poorly, and it was the idea that they're the ones that are taking the kids to soccer practice and fighting with the puppy in the car. And as somebody in claims once told me, it's not who's driving the car, it's who's in the car that you got to worry about. So we did let the data drive it a little bit, but we don't have any in-house behavioral psychologists, but we started to have those discussions about what does that data mean? So to try to bring back in kind of a business perspective on it, and then, you know, back channel it and try to test it out and try to make sure it makes sense. But a lot of it is, does it intuitively make sense? It has to intuitively make sense. And when we started talking internally, I grew up in a small town, most of the people that work for our company grew up in small towns, we all said, oh God, yeah. We were driving a tractor at 14, we were driving around, my dad let me go pick up my mom at 14 years old in a small town. It just is a different mentality, there's no fear of driving. So it intuitively made sense, and that supported it. And then that's when we started really taking a serious look at, okay, this makes sense to us, let's make sure that if we're gonna be aggressive, the data supports it. So you're doing both simultaneously, but it was a lot about the data driving it to begin with, yeah.
You know, I think Paul outlined very nicely the process of developing a business case and then testing it all the way through the process, and ultimately that's the only way that these things should be deployed. And you were obviously successful when you did that. One more question.
Yeah, so with applied systems, so I work with a lot of small brokerages, and I find a lot of them don't have data or they're not using data and analytics. I'm wondering if you have any practical advice for an organization who's looking to, as a first step, get into the world of analytics, get into the world of data. You guys are very experienced and run these projects on a quarterly basis, I'm sure, but people looking to do it, what would your practical advice be for them?
Start small. Find a use case that they think, I think there's something here if we can get the data, and try to prove it. Build up a knowledge of the types of the information that they already have available, and how that they can pull it out to actually make some decisions on. Don't try to boil the ocean. Just start with something that would be of value to their business, and figure out what pieces of information that they have to prove it to take that further along.
Good, I think we better wrap it up. So I'd like to thank Paul, Steve, Larry for taking the time out of your busy schedules to be grilled by me inappropriately.